Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I'm on my final 6 albums for this year, and this set of albums is always kind of tricky because when you get towards the end of the year, as close as we are, it gets really hard to assess these albums as potential albums of the year when you only have them for like a month and a half. So I treat these albums a little bit differently than a lot of the other ones. That's why I like to call this particular post the Coda, because it doesn't belong to any particular tier, but these are albums that will go directly to the finals and will have a chance at album of the year, but also could potentially gain a second life next spring. So let's get started with Geese, Getting Killed. This is Geese's 3rd album, and 4th really if you include lead singer Cameron Winter's kind of developmentally relevant solo album that was released earlier this year. And this album's been getting a lot of rave reviews from listeners and critics alike, and I think one of the reasons why that's the case is because it kind of blends the roots of rock music with more current Gen Z sensibilities. Now in my mind, I hear Geese blending the early ramshackle blues rock of the Rolling Stones with a little bit more current dreamlike introspectiveness of like Radiohead. And they primarily get the sound, I think, by replacing Mick Jagger's characteristic rock swagger with the distinctive anxiety that Thom Yorke always had as the Radiohead lead singer. But use this anxiety as a musical engine to assert the humanity over like polished AI music that we seem to be increasingly inundated with. Getting Killed is disorderly and chaotic, but paradoxically really anthemic and has lyrics I think that many people in contemporary live, contemporary society can really relate to. It's a genre-bending collision of classic rock swagger with modern introspection. It kind of pushes back against slickness and algorithms, instead reclaiming the human mess that's at the core of rock music. I got Lunatic Soul's The World Under Unsun. Lunatic Soul is a long-standing solo project for Maurice Duda, who's the lead singer for Riverside. And it kind of works as a counter-narrative to that group's kind of prog metal, neo-prog leanings. And although it's still progressive music at its core, Maurice Duda has gone to great lengths throughout the entire career as Lunatic Soul to distance it from the sound of Riverside by really leaning more on atmospheres and bass work over other more identifiable progressive rock tropes. Now, each of the Lunatic Soul albums, even though it works as sort of a counterbalance to the work that he does with Riverside, has its own character. Like, for example, the last album, Through Shaded Woods, kind of took a little bit more of a folky approach to the Lunatic Soul paradigm. And many of the other albums have been very electronic in nature. One of the unifying themes throughout is that he's really tries to avoid using electric guitar in a lot of the albums. If you listen to the album and you hear electric guitar, generally speaking, you're hearing him play piccolo basses, a bass tuned up to sound like a guitar, but with the physical interaction that you'd have as a bass player. But beyond that, the tone that I get out of The World Under Unsun is it really is a mix between progressive rock music and kind of ambient music. This one seems to lean a little bit more towards ambient atmospheres. Now, that's not to say that this is entirely an ambient album. There's definitely some heavier moments in here, especially when he turns on the bass player in his mind. He's got these very complex riffs that kind of happen to propel things along. And if you listen carefully, you can hear him play some pretty amazing virtuosic bass. Even though this doesn't really have virtuosity as one of its driving factors, the guy can play the bass, especially if you're used to the way that like Justin Chancellor from Tool plays, that kind of harmonic chordal playing. Maurice Duda is really able to capture that and use it to his advantage on this album. Now, it's also a double album, so as such, it's a little bit of a longer listen. And for a more passive listen, there's more ambient sections that happen in this album. It can kind of test one's attention span. But I would say that this ambient drift is not accidental, but it's really actually very purposeful. And as such, it really rewards like intentional immersion. The Lunatic Soul albums are all meant to be a singular narrative about life and death. And this particular album is supposed to be the final chapter in that. However, timeline-wise, it's supposed to go between 2 other albums, Walking a Flashlight Beam and Fractured. And I would really love it if sometime Maurice Duda would kind of give us a Cliff Notes version of the entire thematic journey that we're supposed to be taking on as we listen to all these albums. But as such, as the final chapter in the Lunatic Soul arc, it's a really great closing statement. Next I got Luxuries, Like Unto Lambs. Luxury is a group with a very, very interesting history that started off as them as a Christian rock group. Now, even though they were kind of on Christian rock labels and were part of that community, the way that they approached Christian rock was never, preachy or proselytizing in any way. They're probably better defined as an alternative rock group with genuine spiritual depth. And as such, they really broke the sort of Christian secular binarism that was in effect as the Reagan era sort of siloed Christian music into its own realm. Now, if you want to get more into the history of this band, there's a really great documentary called Parallel Love about them and about the events that led to their formation and ultimately a big transformation that happened to them after they had this really terrible car crash on the road. The most interesting outcome of that accident was that 3 of the 4 members at the time went on to be Eastern Orthodox priests, and that's a title they still hold today as a current group. And as interesting as all this background is, really musically speaking, is the thing that I find most arresting about this album. Like Unto Lambs is stacked with melodic, emotionally nuanced, and texturally rich songwriting that injects the sort of angular emotional tension of Fugazi with the melodic introspection of the Smiths. The album and the band is spiritually rooted but never preachy and really blends vulnerability and intensity at the crossroads of indie rock music and post-punk.
Headline says it all. The lower circle is in all that fall. In any story is the hardest part. Oh, the ticker tape speaks to me. In this world there is misery. With this world let me make my peace.
Next up I got Mammoth The End. Mammoth is, and has always been, a one-man band consisting of Wolfgang Van Halen, who plays all the music on this album, writes all the music, plays all the instruments on the album. And as always, Wolfgang Van Halen is always struggling to assert his independence while still acknowledging his own legacy. And over the course of the last couple of albums, you can see him slowly but surely becoming more and more confident at the crossroads of these two tensions. And a further step in this direction can be seen by him dropping the WVH from his name. Now, part of this was due to the legal issues finally being resolved with the Mammoth name. Mammoth was the original name for Van Halen, and it was Wolfgang's intention to use that name from the beginning, but there was legal issues with it. So we always did this Mammoth WVH thing, and clearly has worked through all the issues with that and is just going by Mammoth, which I think is fantastic. But it's also a symbolic shift towards autonomy. And calling this album The End, whenever this shift happens, disguises this album as an end that's actually a beginning. Now, to hear Wolfgang talk about this album, you hear his creative process was just slightly different. Very often, for example, he'll program all the drums or his demos and then we'll play them live whenever he actually makes the recording. But in this particular instance, he kind of developed live drum parts and guitar playing simultaneously in the making of the demos. He would play drums in one room, then immediately run to the next room, play guitar, and just play off of those a little bit more than he has in the past. And although for him this may seem like a really big shift, the end result is still high-end musicianship and incredibly polished songwriting and production. But I'll also say that Wolfgang's biggest strength is also his biggest weakness, because his consistency of vision causes him to kind of be a little bit in a holding pattern with his songwriting. And don't get me wrong, the songwriting is fantastic. And if you like one of his songs, you'll probably like all of them. But still there's a sense that maybe, him going for using his instincts as much as he has led him into a little bit of a corner in which he's going to kind of stylistically get a little bit repetitive, even though he's never written a song the same way twice. But I do think The End is a threshold record that's meant to end one phase of his career while beginning another. Next up I got Quadeca, Vanisher, Horizon Scraper. Quadeca had a very almost explosive arc of his career where he's started off as just a YouTube diss track rapper and has become kind of an art pop-auteur. And Vanisher Horizon Scraper is a genre fluid album that really has been pretty critically divisive. It is hip-hop adjacent, but it's not a hip-hop album. And if you come at it like a hip-hop album, you will most likely be disappointed. And this is the same thing that kind of happened with Sleep Token most recently, right? Where critics had this idea that there's a certain one thing, and then the album comes out and it's completely another. And because they defeat that expectation, they get some critical backlash from that. But I see the album as an experimental but ultimately accessible art pop odyssey. And I mean that in the most Greek sense, because this is a concept album that is supposed to trace the journey of a sailor as he goes out in search of his life's meaning. The exploration turns inward, dissolving into this psychological landscape. Now, what's so brilliant about this album is that in some ways it's almost programmatic. It sounds like what it's supposed to be. It captures a seashell ambience, like you put a seashell up to your ear and it reminds you of the ocean. And it achieves this through reverb and other production techniques. And although lyrically speaking, that narrative is definitely in there, I find it more in the nautical feel of the album. And I think the Quadeca is somewhat aware of this because in order to help really drive this narrative home, he went out and made a full album-length video that he flew out to the Philippines and shot. And although that long-form video is also a little bit obtuse in how it relates this narrative, it really does capture the sort of surreal art pop journey that is Vanisher Horizon Scraper. And finally, I got Water Damage Instruments. Water Damage is an Austin-based music collective that, when they perform, has any number of rotating people that come in and out of it. But generally speaking, performances consist of 2 to 3 drummers, several bass players, several guitar players, a guy that's got a homemade electric viola that he plays. Definitely expanded but non-standard instrumentation. Now, Water Damage, as is expressed on instruments, is riff-based drone rock that features maximal repetition and minimal deviation. All 4 tracks in this album sit at around the 20-minute mark and really resist development over the course of that 20 minutes. If you can't listen to the first 30 seconds of this, then you're not going to be able to get into the rest of it, because that 30 seconds is what you're going to be listening to, generally speaking, for the duration of that track. Now, though I personally chafe a little bit at that kind of insistent repetition, there's certainly value to it. I mean, you'll see this to a degree in traditional African music, where the gestalt of polyrhythms all going at once as loud as they can is almost overloads the senses and causes trance to occur in ritual. And I think if you saw Water Damage in a live setting, you get a chance to experience this a little bit more readily than you do just on a disembodied recording. But conversely, this also points of interest on this album if you're able to listen to timbre as its own kind of melody. Looking at it from that perspective, you can think about Hindustani music and the drone. You know, in this case, the droning riff goes on, but there's sort of a timbral and rhythmic variations that can draw your interest if you're able to focus in on that. So for me, I would say in general that Instruments is hypnotic, abrasive, and sometimes a bit tedious. And for me personally, I probably won't put this on very often. It doesn't have a whole lot of replayability for my taste. But if I walked into a club and saw them playing, I would most likely experience the more immersive aspects of what they're trying to do. But that's all I got for you this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe, share out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I've got this huge list of everything I've covered all year long, prime examples from each album, so please go check that out. And if you want to be involved in helping me choose the best albums that I've listened to this year, please contact me through my Patreon below. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.